Today I'm discussing social equity as a measure of public budgeting and finance. My focus is on how taxation, public performance, and budgeting decisions distribute public value across communities. Public budgeting is often evaluated in terms of efficiency, balance, or output, but those standards alone are incomplete. A budget also reflects who bears public burdens, who receives public benefits, and whether government action helps reduce or reinforce existing disparities. The argument is that social equity should be treated as a core standard of budgeting, not as an afterthought. Budgets do more than allocate money, they distribute burdens, benefits, services, and opportunities. Because of that, budgeting is never neutral. A government may appear efficient on paper and still produce inequitable outcomes in practice. So, the real test of public finances is not just how much government spends, but who benefits, who's overlooked, and whether outcomes become more equitable over time. Social equity refers to the fair and just distribution of public burdens, public resources, public services, and public outcomes. It is important to distinguish equity from equality. Equality means giving everyone the same treatment, but equity asks whether the same treatment actually produces fairness when people begin from a very different starting point. If some communities face deeper barriers, then equal treatment alone may simply preserve existing disparities rather than to correct them. Equity belongs in budgeting because budgeting is fundamentally a process of choice under scarcity. Governments cannot fund everything equally, so even budget decisions reflect values and priorities. Those choices reveal whose needs matter most, what outcome counts, and what burdens citizens are expected to carry. Once budgeting is understood this way, equity is no longer separate from public finance. It becomes part of the budget question itself, because every financial choice has consequences for fairness and distribution. This issue matters because fiscal decisions can create long term inequality that lasts across generations. We can see this in examples such as redlining, unequal school funding, and environmental injustice. These are not just abstract moral concerns, they are budgeting and finance issues because they involve the distribution of public investment, public services, and public protection. These decisions have shaped neighborhood wealth, educational opportunity, and exposure to risk in ways that continue to affect communities today. Taxation is one of the clearest places where equity either becomes operational or is ignored because taxation determines who pays for government. A tax system may look neutral in law, but still create unequal effects in practice. User fees and regressive taxes, for example, often place heavier burdens on lower income households. Even rules that appear race neutral can still produce racially unequal outcomes because of broader economic and historical inequalities. So, equity analysis in public finance has to examine not only how much revenue is raised, but who's carrying the cost. Public performance is also an equity issue because performance systems reveal what governments choose to value. Aggregate numbers can make a program look successful while hiding the disparities beneath the surface. High output does not necessarily mean equitable outcomes. For example, a city may report strong service delivery overall, while still underserving certain neighborhoods or population groups. That is why governments need disaggregated measures, not just citywide averages, if they want a performance system that reflects fairness as well as efficiency. To measure social equity, public administrators have to ask practical questions. Who pays? Who benefits? Who participates? Who's missing from the data? And are disparities shrinking or widening over time? And this can be measured in several ways. Tax incidence, which means looking at which groups actually bear the burdens of taxes, for example, whether sales tax takes a larger share of income from low income households than from wealthy households. And then, of course, there's revenue composition. That looks at where government money comes from, such as whether a city depends more on a progressive income tax or a regressive fee and fines. That's why it's important to disaggregate the outcome data, and that means breaking results down by race, income, neighborhood, and other group differences, so that a city can see whether services are reaching everyone equally. And then there's procedural and distributive indicators, which measure both whether people have a fair chance to participate in the decisions and whether the actual benefits and burdens of the policies are distributed fairly. This is where equity becomes practical. It stops being only a value statement and becomes an actual framework for measurement. This matters for public administration because efficient budgeting by itself is not enough. Strong budgeting systems should also be equitable, evidence based, and transparent. If equity is truly a public value, then it has to appear throughout the system in revenue policy, in spending priorities, and in performance assessment. Public administrators are not only responsible for managing those resources well, they are also responsible for ensuring that public institutions do not reproduce avoidable disparities through the way they raise revenue and measure success. In conclusion, public budgeting and finances are not neutral processes. They shape who pays, who benefits, and whose needs are recognized in government decision making. Social equity should therefore be treated as a measurable standard, not simply as an abstract ideal. Taxation and performance systems can either reduce disparities or reproduce them, depending on how they are designed and evaluated. Ultimately, the best test of public finance is who benefits, who is overlooked, and whether outcomes become more equitable over time.